He was found inside a scuffed box made for cradling a bassinet. But what he cradled instead was the city's breath, the way a cold night holds a secret too tight. No one knew his name. For decades, Philadelphia learned to speak around him. A whisper with edges, a riddle in the shape of a child. The boy arrived in February 1957, when the wind off the Delaware could slice paper. And sometimes it felt like it sliced people, too. A young man stalking rabbits through the tall, dead grass of Fox Chase paused at a tangle of weeds, at a cardboard carton whose printed letters promised something tender, fragile and handled with care, though what the box held was beyond care. There was a blanket like a faded cloud. There were bruises the color of old plums, a haircut done as if someone had been in a hurry or afraid, clipped close and uneven. There were eyes the police could not meet for long, because they did not point in the same direction anymore. The officers arrived and shuffled their boots, the detectives whose hats were brimmed with the cold. They looked at each other and at the boy, and every look said the same thing. We must do something equal to this. In the first hours, they did everything a city knows to do. They photographed, measured, lifted latent prints from damp cardboard, and tried to trace the box's store in a line of supply that spread like a river delta across the region. They clipped the boy's fingerprints onto pieces of paper and mailed copies to other cities. They announced to the papers that they had found a mystery child, and asked anyone missing a child to come forward. The boy who had been denied a voice entered the city's mouth another way, on ink-stained newsprint, on headlines that shrank as days passed, and then grew again when detectives hammered at new doors. The box itself, with its store-stamp ghosts and a partial serial number, promised a line back to a purchaser. But promises are often the first thing to float away when police lights get turned off, and the wind reclaims a field. The blanket was a printed thing that had once made children smile, now stained. The haircut said someone had cared that he looked changed. Someone who could not bring themselves to see those curls spill into recognition. Every clue hummed at the frequency of fear. Meanwhile, the city learned to carry him. In the delicatessens along Frankfurt Avenue, men with rolled-up sleeves read aloud from the daily news while slicing turkey, their voices low. In row houses, mothers pressed palms to cheeks and thought of their own children. Kids stopped playing stickball to stare at the picture taped to a storefront window, a composite sketch of a small face trying to remain itself despite smudged time. Girls whispered to one another that they had seen a woman on a trolley with a stiff jaw and a blank-eyed boy on her lap, and boys told boys they'd heard a man dug an old china doll from a box and couldn't tell if it breathed. The detectives worked it like a romance. Despite knowing romance is what got them into trouble in the first place, they loved the boy they did not know. They drove through nights that had no corners. They measured every orphanage and home for the unwanted in tri-state distance. They returned again and again to Susquehanna Road, to the cold that made a box try to curl away from the world. They enlisted postmen because the mail sees everything. They kept the boy on a steel table at the morgue for longer than they were supposed to, waiting for someone brave enough or guilty enough or loving enough to claim him. No one did. There were theories. Of course there were theories, because human beings would rather sail a paper boat into a hurricane of speculation than sit on a dry shore of not knowing. One theory said a traveling carnival had passed through and left behind something it could not carry. Another said a reformatory had grown tired of its least perfect child. A third said a woman, unmarried and frightened, had made a choice that would finish her. These were less theories than doorways, but every doorway opened onto a room containing no one. A year passed. Then two. The boy became a headline that could be rearranged. Boy in the box sighting. Boy in the box update. Boy in the box still unsolved. Detectives came and retired. Their framed photos on the precinct wall watched new men tie their ties in the reflection of old glass. Files thickened like winter coats. A few of the old-timers carried his photograph in their wallets, next to their own children's school portraits. They'd open the leather in diners at the end of the night shift and look, not as a cop looks, but as a father looks, and then slide the wallet closed with the soft click of something you lock away because you have to keep walking. A man named Remington, who had the heavy patience of a chess player, had the case at the start and then again at the middle. Later he would say the boy had been placed in his life like a stone you cannot move around, so you build the rest of your garden to honor its refusal. He knocked on doors in neighborhoods carved into the alphabet of the city. A for Allegheny, B for Broad, C for Chestnut, each door opening onto new silence. He lived with the case the way a city lives with a river. You do not think of it every minute, but it shapes your roads and the way the light looks. Some nights the detectives stood at the field and listened. The road did not tell them anything. The wires along the fences thrummed a weather song. The grass hissed when the wind poured through, like sound trying to tell you what went wrong and failing. On one of those nights, Remington remembered, he found himself thinking of a boy learning his name and how much work that is. Those first months when you hear it in your mother's mouth, and then you try it out in your own, and it feels like a door you can open to find yourself inside. He thought about a world in which no one says your name. He said it aloud then, some made-up name, and the wind took it, and the detective felt foolish and then never did it again. The city buried the boy when there was nothing else to do. A small plot, a stone that did not say who. Visitors came, a few at first and then more. School children on field trips leaned in and read the inscription, and then didn't talk for the rest of the day. Teenagers came at midnight to dare themselves to feel something, and some of them did. Old women walked with canes for the last stretch and pressed petals into the grass. A priest who never wrote sermons down because he believed in what arrived when words trusted him, stood over the grave and felt the strange radiance of justice still owed. Years, then decades. The case entered the city's folklore, told like a whispered parable at kitchen tables. Remember the boy we couldn't name, the one we promised to remember anyway. Tip lines sizzled and went dark. A psychic wrote a letter claiming the boy was a little prince from a European tragedy. Another letter said he was a twin whose brother lived in the next county with a woman whose hands had a way of trembling when she peeled potatoes. The detectives read them all, because hope is the most practical tool they own. Sometimes the story would abruptly glow again, as if a light bulb in a cellar flickered to steady life. A woman walked into the precinct one afternoon, controlled and blazing, and said she had been a child then, that she had seen something in a neighbor's backyard she couldn't let herself see. Not until now. She told them of a boy who slept in a shed and of a mother with eyes like drilled glass. She spoke in a rush and then in measured breaths, and the detectives wrote it all down. They investigated for months. In the end, nothing matched, or didn't match enough. The woman went home carrying a new weight, and the detectives went for coffee and felt the old weight settle back into its familiar place on their ribs. And then the world changed. Not overnight, because nothing kind truly happens overnight, but slowly. People began to put their DNA into envelopes and send it away to companies that promised to tell them their origin stories. Here is why your nose is your grandmother's. Here is why your knees hurt when it rains. Police asked themselves whether a boy from 1957 could live again in the helix of another person, whether an identity could be coaxed out of a hair clipped in sorrow, a sliver of beneath the fingernails time. The old detectives who had put their faith in shoe leather and knocking were gone or near it. But the new detectives found that science wanted to join the love that had animated their predecessors. They exhumed. They whispered apologies to the ground, and the city accepted. A lab across the river and then another in another state handled the boy like a prayer. And somewhere, in a clean room filled with lights that made everything look unaccidental, a technician saw numbers assemble into a code that translated to family. Not a name yet, but the outline of one. On computer screens, ancestral maps blossomed with little dots and lines connecting them. Somewhere in the tree was an uncle who didn't know he was an uncle. A cousin who had forgotten the year she stopped receiving Christmas cards from the branch that had bent away from the trunk. Investigators reached out carefully. They explained the story, and on the other end of the line, a silence arrived that felt less like shock and more like the world making room for something that had always been waiting. It was not simple. It never is. What began as a case among maples and telephone poles ended up as a study of migration and choices. Who left whom? Who changed their name when the war ended? Who took in a child for a summer and thereafter suffered an emptiness they taught themselves to live with? The case became a chandelier of could-bes. Each crystal caught light from another, and the detectives followed the refractions. A man in his 70s answered the door with a wariness that softened when he saw the old photograph. He shook his head, but not to say no, more to shake loose something frightened. He sat at the kitchen table and told a story about his sister. And as he spoke, the detectives felt the room growing larger, the walls bending outward to accommodate what he had kept small inside himself for so long. The day came in a winter that was a cousin to the winter of 1957, when the city gathered in a room with microphones and the faces of men and women who had built their lives into this one revelation. And they said the name. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The syllables crossed the air and arrived where they were meant to, and people cried for a boy who had been dead longer than most of them had been alive. The detectives were careful. They did not pretend that saying a name solves a murder or heals the harm, but they also did not pretend that saying it was nothing. Names are the handles we use to carry what cannot be carried. The city learned it quickly, like a hymn. Joseph, Gus, Joey. Some of the people who had visited his grave for years went there that day and repeated his name under their breath and discovered that language sometimes does change the temperature of the air. Others sat at their kitchen tables and spread out the newspaper the way their parents had, and the way their grandparents had before them, and they felt the long rope of time pulled taut between the past and the present. And for a moment, it did not hurt their hands to hold it. With the name came other facts, the kind that land softly and the kind that fall like a sack of stones. The year of his birth, the city blocks where his family lived, the adults who had failed to keep him safe, and all the questions still in orbit around the box and the field and the haircut. Some things you identify, others you must learn to understand, and that takes its own patience. Detectives, new and old, moved the murder file to the section where the light fell differently. They knew that an identity is both an answer and a tool. With it, they could knock on doors not just as guardians of the public's curiosity, but as caretakers of a family's history. The story did not end there, because stories like this do not end. They widen. People who had been children in 1957, who had kept the clipping in a drawer, who had touched its edge on the day they moved apartments, or on the day their own children were born, came forward to say they remembered a woman who cried in the grocery store line, or a man who once hammered shut a crate and would not tell his wife what he'd packed. Nothing was certain enough to be custody of the truth. But everything formed a weather pattern of human beings trying to be part of the healing. For the detectives, the work had always been to push through noise toward music. They went back into the old notes, where a detective long dead had scribbled a line about a caller who claimed to know the family name but was afraid to say it aloud. They visited the address, which now had a different shade of shutters and a swing set in the yard. The new owners let them look lightly around for ghosts, and when the detectives left, One of them paused and stared at the sidewalk, at the cracks like small tributaries. He thought of water finding its way eventually to the sea. At the grave, a new stone arrived. It had a name now, and a date of birth and a date of death. The hyphen between them thinner and sharper than any in the cemetery, because it had been forged from the way a city learned to carry what could not be carried. Strangers left toy cars and small baseballs and a folded paper crane or two. A woman with a voice like flannel sang a lullaby not into the air, but down where she imagined his ears might be. A man who had never learned how to pray prayed. It is easy to say that the city loved him. It is harder to say how. It loved him by refusing to forget. It loved him by telling his story without bartering for sensational gashes, by holding back the kind of fascination that stains. It loved him by asking again and again what love requires in the face of harm done to the smallest among us. For some, it required adoption papers and late-night cups of tea while a child raged himself into sleep. For others, it required staffing the phones for a tip line 2 decades after the last decent tip. For a few, love required the discipline of a lab, counting repeats in a sequence until a lineage appeared. To speak of Joseph is to speak of the way grief teaches you the exact size of the world and then shrinks or expands it unexpectedly. The detectives learned that the world was exactly the size of a boy's name, and they learned it could be expanded by a community's stubborn tenderness. The city learned that time, which it had long believed to be the one tenant that always paid its rent, could sometimes be cornered and asked to answer for itself. But there was still the matter of the night and the field. The winter sky, hawk-cold and speckled with stars. Somewhere, someone must know the way the box was carried, the way the blanket was tucked, the way the clipper's teeth chattered through new hair. Someone must remember the room where the decision was made, and the fear that pooled like oil under it. The investigation, armed with the boy's name, narrowed its circles. It met the family history with as much mercy as is possible in the messy economy of justice. It weighed allegations against memory, memory against evidence, evidence against the strange silence that takes the shape of a person who refuses to speak. No court convened, not yet. But in kitchens and precinct rooms and public meetings, people practiced saying the name without sorrow's hitch catching in their throats, because they wanted someday to say it calmly, in a sentence that ended with the word solved. In the meantime, the boy, Joseph, belonged to himself again. The children who came to his grave now could bring him the kind of news children bring. I got an A on my spelling test. I hit a double. My dog isn't sick anymore. Elderly men from the neighborhood who had run paper. Roots, when the story first broke, leaned on their canes and told him, quietly, what it had felt like to toss that newspaper onto stoops and see the headline ride the air. A retired detective came once a week and fixed the flowers. He did it as if he were filing a report, regular, exact, respectful. One spring, a robin built a nest in the dogwood near the grave. The eggs were the color of kind mornings. People noticed, because once you teach yourself to watch a grave, you tend to see all the small lives that cluster around the idea of an ending. A boy with a cowlick named Max kept coming back until the eggs hatched, and he told Joseph how the babies opened their beaks, and he could see the sun through the thinness of their throats. He brought a drawing and tucked it under a stone. Years from now, Max will tell someone why he learned to be gentle with the places inside him that didn't have names yet. The field in Fox Chase still exists, though development presses in on everything, and sometimes a drone goes up and looks down with its indifferent camera eye, recording the exact line where the past touches the present, and both pretend not to notice. A jogger in a bright jacket runs along the edge at sunrise and does not know he's running through a story. A teacher who lives nearby walks her old dog there and tells it what the week has done to her. Because a field once borrowed a secret, and so perhaps it can hold hers too. Now and then, someone who knows stands at the place and closes their eyes, and hears the box's cardboard rustle, a sound like the world almost letting go. If you ask what changed when the name arrived, you will get different answers. A detective will tell you the change was procedural as much as spiritual. Genealogical investigation moves the fulcrum of what is possible. A priest will tell you the soul of a city grew by a measure impossible to quantify. A grandmother will say she finally slept well the night she read it, and she does not sleep well often. A man who once made the mistake of believing that everything unclaimed stays that way will tell you he learned otherwise. And if you ask what remains, the answer is simpler. A grave with a name. A box that once promised something it did not deliver. A winter field that held steady under the weight of a moment so heavy that it sagged the future a little. An old photograph in the corner of a bulletin board that the janitor dusts with the care of a sacristan. Scissors, a blanket, a question, a boy. And the city that decided that even if his last night was one of the loneliest nights that can be had, his afterlife would be crowded with people who would not stop whispering his name. In a small house not far from where the Schuylkill turns like an elbow, a woman keeps a folder in a drawer. It contains clippings from the 1950s and from 2022, and a piece of paper on which she wrote, in the careful hand of someone who knows letters are a kind of prayer, Joseph Augustus Zarelli, February 1957. She is not related to him. She never met him. She is the kind of person the city makes, who recognizes that stories sometimes choose their caretakers. When she opens the drawer, she speaks to him and tells him ordinary things. That the supermarket strawberries are finally sweet again. That the neighbor's baby has started to laugh. That the man next door has returned from the hospital and is walking on the sidewalk each morning. Steady but slow. She tells him he has given her something to carry. And strangely, it has made other burdens lighter. One summer, the city placed a wreath by the stone. It was made of laurel and a ribbon the color of early evening. A trio of kids on scooters sped past and then circled back, because curiosity has always been children's best invention. They asked the groundskeeper who the ribbon was for. He told them. The smallest one repeated the name, and the other two echoed it, and then all three went silent. The way children do when they realize the world has rules they cannot yet see but can already feel. After a moment, the smallest one said, "Okay," and they scootered off, their wheels whispering through the grass. There is a man alive now who holds the missing piece. He is older than he was when he promised himself he would never talk. He wakes sometimes in the middle of the night and sits on the edge of the bed and feels his past like a hand on his shoulder, and he does not shrug it off. He will tell what he knows, or he will die with it. Either way, the city has already done something remarkable, which is to have kept faith with a boy who gave it nothing except the chance to become the kind of place that keeps faith. Maybe the man will walk into a station one day and say the name of the room, the blanket, the haircut, the dark. Maybe he will write a letter and sign it, and then throw up his hands and go sit under a tree and wait. Maybe he will continue as he has, the way secrets sometimes eat their keepers from the inside out. If he speaks, the city will not cheer. It will breathe in, breathe out, and say thank you, and then turn toward the work of consequence. If he does not, the city will continue to carry the boy the way it carries its rivers, its bridges, the exact sound of Wawa coffee pouring into a paper cup at dawn. Because this is the truest thing the story teaches, that to bear witness is sometimes the most transformative action possible. And that witness is a collective verb here. The police, the press, the people who brought flowers, the teachers who taught the case as a lesson in perseverance, the scientists who coaxed a name from dust, the priests and rabbis who found words for the space between rage and forgiveness, the children who whispered Joseph under their breath. All of them lived into a promise, We will not let the smallest among us vanish into our indifference. This is what the city has chosen to mean when it says his name. And if you walk through the cemetery on a day when the light slants like a shy apology, and you stop beside the stone and you say, "Hello, Joseph," and you wait, you might hear nothing but leaves and birds and your own breath, or you might feel, not hear, something unclench. You might feel the long, thin hyphen between his dates loosen its knot of grief and become, for a breath or two, a thread. You hold it without tugging. You let it lie across your palm. It is not enough. It is what we have. It is how a city, learning over and over how to be kind, keeps a boy company in the long after.